It can be daunting to share the story of Jesus to your kids, especially when the Bible is filled with some really difficult topics. This week, we talk about how to talk to your kids about Jesus, how to guide them through difficult topics and questions, and how to read the Bible to or with your little ones. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the Olive Shoots Family Podcast, where we talk about family and parenting, homesteading, and the things God is leading us towards. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Brittany. We've been married for 3 years, have one little boy, and just got our first piece of land where we plan to build and start our homestead. We are passionate about the family unit and getting back to the basics of the way God created us to live. We have big dreams and are learning what it looks like to pursue those dreams while first trusting God's leading.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. I think one of the really great things about following Jesus, and also one of the really hard things about following Jesus, is that we are constantly growing. As he leads us in life, he's showing us new things. He's teaching us more about himself, about his character, about what it looks like to follow him. And that's a great thing. It's a lifelong decision and commitment and changing and big churchy word, sanctifying experience to follow Jesus. And that's great. But it also makes it a little bit difficult to share that with our children, especially in ways that they can comprehend and understand, because to follow Jesus is a very grand and big, not just a decision, but it's also something that's a lifelong process. And that can be hard to share. That can be hard to present well to our kids. I think one of the things that we try to avoid as parents is to give an oversimplified version of what it looks like to follow Jesus. I think many of us in our generation, or at least for me and Britt, at some point in our lives, we've heard the stereotypical, just pray this prayer, and that's what salvation means. And that's a piece of salvation. That's a piece of what it looks like to start following Jesus. But it's definitely not the whole. And so how do we represent that well to our children? How do we tell them about who Jesus is? How do we talk to them about Scripture? Introduce them to reading the Scriptures? And even when the time comes, how do we talk about these big topics, these big ideas like salvation, like sin, like righteousness, and faith? Sometimes they're difficult to get into with our kids, especially at younger ages.
Yeah, I think this is something that when you were family pastor and youth minister, it was something that parents asked a lot of, just okay, my kid is asking this question, how do I talk about it with them? Or my kid is wanting to read the Bible all the way through, and I don't know if they're old enough for that. What do I do? Just those types of questions of guiding our kids when they are interested, and then also, like you were talking about, just presenting it well in the first place, because it can be a confusing, broad topic, obviously. But I think that's something that, obviously, we're not really there yet with Emerson, but it's something that, being a family pastor, you've had experience in, and also have had already been thinking through a lot of those things just from parents coming to you and asking, what about this, or stuff like that.
Yeah. I've had those kind of conversations a lot, and but it is difficult because, just like what you were saying, when a parent has come to me before and they've been like, hey, my kid really wants to start reading the Bible. And then they opened up to the first few pages and it's like, oh, there's some stuff in there that maybe is not great for a kid to read.
Yeah, we really see the Bible in a different perspective whenever we're considering letting our 8-year-old read it, or letting I mean, even a 10-year-old, or like,
Yeah.
just like we read through the Bible, and as an adult, way differently than we would whenever we're like, oh, our kid's about to read this story. That means I'm going to have to answer questions about that.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, because we've grown up with the Bible, we've grown up with these stories, we've almost desensitized ourselves to them in a lot of ways. So like on page 2 of the Bible, 2 or 3 of the Bible, you have Adam and Eve who eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and what happens? They realize they're naked. And that's not a huge thing, like especially as parents, like at some point you become, you realize nakedness is a part of life, especially in a married couple. But for a little kid who can't even fathom that a man and a woman would ever be naked together, and that's so embarrassing. That's the most embarrassing thing in the world. Like, you've made it to page 3 of the Bible before something embarrassing.
It just gets worse from there.
It gets much worse from there. And I think that's part of the point of the biblical story, is that things get a lot worse. But how do we introduce that to our kids in a way that is age appropriate, and not just appropriate, but age understanding?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also like, my first instinct is like, well, we just need to pretty much skip most of the Old Testament until they're old enough. But then at the same time, no, we don't want to make it be like, the Bible's bad, the Old Testament's bad, there's not, like, it's too old for you, you can't read it. Like, that's not a good way to, when they're children and they're asking about it, they're genuinely, like, they're engaged, they're interested at that point. Who knows if they're going to be later if we told them no, it's a bad thing, or it's not it's not appropriate, or like, who knows if they're ever going to want to do that again, for one. And two, we don't want to paint the picture that the Bible's something they can't read.
Right.
Even though there is hard conversations, hard life stuff in it.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things, especially with the Old Testament stories, is that the Bible paints a realistic portrayal of what humanity and human life looks like. And so just like in other things in the real world, there are things we want to shelter our kids from. As young children, I don't want to teach my 2-year-old about murder or about violent things that happen in the world. I want to protect him from that. And one day there will be a time where it is appropriate to say, hey, this is something that is bad in our world. And not only do you have to watch out for it, but maybe it is your calling to stand up for justice and righteousness. Maybe that's something God is leading you to. But I don't want to have that conversation right now. And same thing with the biblical story. The portrayal of the Bible paints a real picture of what humanity looks like and our response and our rebellion against God. But at the same time, I don't want my children knowing exactly how humanity rebels in every case scenario.
Yeah. And I think one thing, like, to remember as if kids are interested in reading the Bible, or we're reading it together as a family, and we come across those things that we're not necessarily wanting them to fully know about, if they're not asking questions, it's not like we have to read through and say, oh, we just read about murder, or we just read about, whenever somebody's sleeping with somebody else's spouse, or whatever, like all those different stories that happen at the very beginning. If they're not asking, it's not like you have to pause and explain every single thing at that moment. And I think that's something to remember. A lot of times they're going to read over that stuff, and no, they're not going to know exactly what they're reading, but that's okay. They don't have to know exactly what they're reading, and we don't have to explain it, and they might not ask. And if they do ask, then we have to figure out and pray about how to explain that in an appropriate and age mature level. But it's also, I think, like a good chance that they're not going to ask a lot of those questions. They're just going to read over them because it's a big word. They don't know what it means.
Right.
So I think that's a fear, like, of that I would have, of like, well, I don't want them to know all this stuff, but the chance of them asking about every single thing that we don't want is very slim.
Yeah.
Especially as a young age.
Yeah. And in talking about those things, like, maybe our kids will gloss over it and they won't exactly understand what is going on in the story, like the specifics of it. But even, in the example of, like, I don't want to share some of the things that go on in the world because maybe I don't want them to hear that, or to what Brittany was saying, maybe they wouldn't even understand what that meant in the moment. But that general concept of, we live in a fallen world. We live in a world that isn't good, right? Our kids can understand that. Mm-hmm. When other kids in the nursery or at daycare or at school or at church or at youth group or whatever that is, when they're mean to them, they understand they're in a world that isn't perfect, that isn't the way it should be. And so they can understand that general concept. And so even if we're not telling them the specifics of stories, right? Maybe we don't want them to know that David saw a naked woman and slept with her. But we can share the concept that even though King David was a great man, he was a man who was following after God's own heart, he still messed up really bad. And he hurt God's heart because he didn't choose to follow him. And that is a concept that they're able to understand without knowing the specifics of adultery. And so just teaching them as you're going through those stories that maybe you skip over some of the details, I think that's fine, as long as we're still painting that picture of what the Bible teaches, is that humanity is on a decline, is on a slow decline from the garden to the cross. And we need Jesus. And that's the picture that the Old Testament paints, is that we need Jesus. We need a Savior.
Yeah, and I think that's something that parents need to have those types of conversations, because, I mean, thinking back to nursery and church, kids' church at school, kids' church as when we were kids, there's the high point stories that we all learn, right? Like, we learn about David, we learn about Jonah, we learn about just all the main characters of the Old Testament, but we don't learn about them to that extent, because church kids, teachers, I think, are careful with that also. Like, they're not going to overshare. And so when we hear about David as a kid, it's David was this kid who was named king really early, and then he went and killed Goliath, and then that's pretty much all we hear about David.
Maybe he stole a rubber ducky or two, but
Yeah, Veggie Tales. But we don't hear, no, David wasn't perfect. He did mess up, and he did hurt God's heart, like you said, and he still had to. He wasn't just always saved and always the chosen one. Like, he still had to choose to follow God, and he messed up, and he had to turn back to God. And we don't hear that part in church very often, because we just hear the high point, he killed the giant. And I think that's how a lot of the stories are. We don't hear and I don't think that's bad on the church. I'm not saying that. I just think that as we're reading through those stories as parents, and we're rehashing it with them when they're telling us what they learned at church, it's okay for us to go into that, to more detail, and to have those conversations of, all these people in the Bible were not just perfect heroes. They're just like us. They messed up just like we do. And you're like them more than you think you are. They're not somebody that you can never attain or never try to chase after. Mm-hmm. I mean, not that we should be chasing after them, but you know what I'm saying? It's not like Emerson can compare himself to David more than just, oh, David was this cool person and I'm never going to slay a giant, so I have no relation to him whatsoever.
Right.
No, the point of David is that he continued to go after what God wanted, even when he got it wrong. He would turn back and try to figure out what God wanted and follow God. And so, yeah, I think that as parents, we can't just rely on the church to paint that picture of the Old Testament, because they're not going to always do that in a kid's class.
Yeah.
Just like we wouldn't if we were teaching other parents' kids.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think even that example of like David killing the giant and like all these great stories that we tell about David, if all our children hear are the great things about David, then what separates him from Jesus? If David could do everything that God wanted him to do, then what separates him from Jesus?
And why did he need Jesus?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think as we're, those moments of sharing the great and sharing the stories that are easy to share about.
Yeah. It's
easy to talk about slaying a giant, even though we leave off the part where David runs up and, saws the head off of Goliath. But, that's okay. It's easy to share about that story. But it's hard to introduce the places in which David falls, and he falls short, because it's difficult topics and because sin is hard to swallow. But that's the stuff that points back to Jesus. And I think even that in and of itself is sometimes daunting for us as parents, because we want to share about Jesus. We want to tell about Jesus. But in sharing about Jesus, we inherently highlight our faults and our flaws and the ways in which we fall short of following Jesus. Because as we share about a perfect man, and we share about God who has come to be with us, and we say things like, we follow Jesus and we want to live like Jesus, and then, oh yeah, I lost my temper last night and I said some things maybe I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry. Right? When we start talking about Jesus, it highlights the ways in which we aren't like him. And that can be difficult as parents. And I also think sharing about Jesus, we're sharing about God himself, that he is infinitely he is infinitely wise, he is infinitely knowing, and sometimes our kids are going to ask us questions that we have no clue how to answer. And I think that's okay too.
Yeah, you're better. I think you're better about that than I am, because I want the answer, but you're usually okay with saying, I don't know. That's a really good question, but I don't know. I think like we were in kids' church this morning, and somebody asked, we were talking about creation, and somebody asked a good question. They were like, what were we talking about?
We were talking about the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. And then that they gave all the that he put all the vegetation for us to eat, and for humans to eat and animals to eat. And somebody raised their hand and said, so does that mean God made us to all be vegetarian? And like, maybe. Nathan's like, well, I mean, the first animal wasn't killed till after sin, but that doesn't mean that like sin entered pretty quickly. So that doesn't mean that was his plan, but who knows? But it's just like, kids ask those types of questions. Like, that's a good question. I've never thought of that question. Mm-hmm. I've never read the story of creation and been like, did God not want us to eat meat? But he just thought of that. And I think a lot of kids are good at coming up with those questions that honestly make us think even more, or look at the story in a different way, because it's like, yeah, that was something I've never thought of.
Yeah. Well, I also think kids just have a unique perspective of things, and sometimes they'll pick things up and say things that to us seem like they're out of left field and like out of nowhere, and like, where in the world did you learn that? Where in the world did you hear that from? But they just pick it up and they get it because they see things in a different way.
Yeah, and sometimes a more simplistic way.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And that can be super difficult as parents, because I mean, I'll just be honest, and maybe this is a selfish thing, maybe this is a prideful thing. I want my kids to see me as someone who knows things. Like I want
all the answers.
I want my kids to see me as someone who is wise and worth listening to. And I feel like to some degree I am. In a lot of ways I'm not. But I want them to see me that way, because I want them to trust me as their father. And to know that the things that I have to say are worth listening to. I know there's going to be a point where...
Yeah, but I think that to that point exactly, then it's even more so okay to say, I don't know. That was a really good question, but I don't know the answer to that. Because if we just fumble or make something up, then they're going to realize we're making stuff up eventually. And then the stuff that we do know and that we do have to say, they might not, like, they're going to get to a point where they're like, well, we don't know what you're saying. Like, if you ever know what you're saying is true, or like, I think, just as I'm hearing you say that, it, like, even more so, it's okay to say, I don't know, because that's going to make the things that we do know, or that we have studied out, or that we do feel like God has showed us, or whatever, hold more weight, because we actually have an answer. Not that we're always going to be right when we have an answer, but like, it is okay to say, I don't know, that's a good question. Like,
No,
or
for
let's
sure.
look it out. Let's look up that together. Like, let's find some other passages together. Like, let's try to figure this out.
For sure. But I also think that's something that I have to battle with in my mind.
Yeah.
And that's what I think that's kind of what I'm getting
too.
at. Yeah, that's what I'm getting at is like,
I would love to be right. I have an answer every single time.
My first reaction is to give the answer because I want to be that authority. And I think, to your point, that's not something we have to be, or even that's not something we're called to be.
Yeah.
And I think in especially in the context of following Jesus, like Jesus is not, he's not just an idea. He's a person that we follow. He's not just a concept that we generally know of, but he's a God become man that we choose to give our lives to be like and to surrender to and to follow. Think of it like if I'm reading a book and there's a character in a book, I can quote off, facts about this person. I can, or if I'm watching a movie and like love a character in a movie, I can quote lines that they said. I can tell you about their backstory. I can tell you all these things about them. But at some point, all of those things are finite and will come to an end. Even if I know every single thing about them. Even if I know, I don't know, what's coming to mind is like Peter from the Chronicles of Narnia. Like, if I know every single thing about Peter, that's not my favorite. That's just the one that's coming to my mind right now. I can know every single thing about Peter from the Chronicles of Narnia, but there's only 7 books worth of stuff. At some point, that knowledge is going to come to an end. And that's not what teaching our kids about Jesus is about. Because the knowledge of Jesus is not finite. For as long as Jesus is alive, we will get to know more and more about Jesus. And the good news is that he is very much so alive with us today. And so following Jesus is not just, telling about Jesus is not just describing a character from a story, but it's explaining to our children and telling them about this person that we've chosen to follow, that we look to them for the answers. And so it becomes less about knowledge and more about faith, which is ultimately what we want our kids to know about.
Yeah, and I think in those times where we don't have the answers and we're like, as they get older, like that starts with us maybe trying to find answers together, and maybe they ask a question that there's not that we're not going to be able to go to Google or go to another passage in the Bible and answer that question. It's like, because there's questions in the Bible that we don't know. Nobody knows the exact. But also just teaching them how to pray about that, how to search it out for themselves, how to read the context of around what their what the question is, and like you said, pointing them to Jesus, pointing them to the authority, not just saying, well, I know everything. Because we really don't want our 18-year-old to feel like they have to come to us to ask every Bible question because they have no idea how to read the Bible for themselves. Like, ideally, we don't want that. Ideally, as they get older, we would hope that they're learning how to read the Bible and they're engaged in it and they're seeking Jesus when they have questions, not always coming to us, right? And so, I mean, obviously, we want them to still come to us. We would be sad if they never came to us for wisdom. But just we don't want them to feel like we're the only ones that have the answers, because we're not. And ultimately don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
Is your baby or toddler teething? I'm always looking for natural products to give my baby instead of over-the-counter medicines that often contain artificial colors, flavors, added sweeteners, and other non-essential ingredients. Earthley's Teeth Tamer has been great. It's made from whole cloves and catnip, which works to reduce pain and swelling and provides a feeling of calmness and relaxation. My baby loves the taste of it, and I can tell it gives him relief. That's a win-win in my book. It's even effective for adults. It can help with pain from cavities, root canals, wisdom teeth removal, braces, and more. It's non-GMO, made in the USA, and made with 100% organic ingredients. If you're interested in Teeth Tamer, click the link in the show notes and check out the other amazing Earthly wellness products while you're at it.
I think one thing that we can do as parents to really reinforce that we're not the ones to be looking towards, like we're supposed to look to Scripture, we're supposed to look to Jesus as people we follow, is instead of like when our kids ask us something about the Bible or about Jesus or about faith or all these different things, to not be quick to give a sermon or a lecture and like, I'm speaking to myself right now because I know this is going to be like one of the hardest things for me to not be like, well, 5-year-old Emerson, this is what the Greek says when we when we go.
Yeah,
and
you're
we
just
look
gonna
at,
be like, yes, he finally asked the first question that I can nerd out on.
Yeah, and it's gonna be hard for me to not do that. But I think if I stop myself from speaking quickly, and I ask questions, I ask really good questions that I can help him to draw out the heart of why he's asking that question and to get at what we're trying to accomplish in him asking that question. So if he, when in a few years or in 10 years, whatever that looks like, when if he starts asking me like about salvation, my first response, if I go off on him and I say, well, salvation is this theological practice, this theological thing that when we surrender our lives over to Jesus and we trust in him as Lord of our lives and we give him our lives, then we are crucified with him. We become sanctified, and he begins in this process with us. Like, I'm going to lose him so fast. But if I turn around and say, well, where'd you hear that word from? What do you think salvation means? Is there a story in the Bible that you were reading about when you heard about salvation? And if I begin to ask these good questions that point to the source of what he's getting at, rather than being like, oh, yes, this is my turn to teach him something new. We can ask these really good questions that they reveal, through those questions, they reveal to us their concept of what these biblical things are like. And then we can respond out of a place of, okay, this is their understanding, and this is how I can guide their heart to what Jesus is revealing to them. And I think especially as younger kids, a lot of the times we can just get so excited that they're bringing up a topic or they're talking to us about like following Jesus or asking Jesus into their heart, and that's a great thing. But maybe to our kids, asking Jesus into their heart, maybe they just saw their best friend do the same thing, and they want to go up on stage in front of other people after seeing their friend get baptized. And I use that example because like I've seen that example in real life. I've had friends when they were younger talk about how that's what they went through as young kids. And so by first asking a question of like, okay, well, what does that mean to you? We're able to really quickly gauge of like, where are they actually at in surrender to Jesus, in God drawing them closer to himself. And then we can go off of that and ask further questions to get at the heart of, well, why do you think that's important? Why do you think it's important to follow Jesus? Is there, what do you want after talking about salvation or talking about following Jesus? Well, do you want to give your life to him? What does that look like for you to give your life to Jesus? Will you have to maybe change some things, change some behaviors, change the way that you treat your siblings? Like, do you know that there's a cost to following Jesus? Like that, asking that first question and getting that understanding allows you to further engage and to know the heart of your child.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because, like you said, I can imagine that the first time that they bring that up as a parent, you're like, yes, they're ready to get saved. Like we did it. Like, not we did it, but like we obviously want our kids to come to know Jesus, and that's a prayer from the beginning of their existence. A lot of us parents. So but we also don't want to lead our kids into a false representation, or even just a false commitment that later down the road they're like, yeah, I already did that, and they had no idea what they were doing.
Right.
Like, we don't want them to just check out of church or check out of whatever anytime that gets brought up because they think they already did it, but they actually don't even know. Like, we want them to really know what they're doing, even if they're 4 or 5 or if they're 10, 11. Like, we don't want to rush them into saying a prayer just because they brought it up at age 5 when they, like you said, have we haven't asked any questions to know what they're actually thinking in the moment. Because like in that moment, I think it would be more like us just trying to save them by them repeating a prayer than them really choosing to follow Jesus because it's something they're genuinely interested in.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that would be difficult for parents, because when that gets brought up, our first instinct is going to be like, yes, like they're ready to do this. They're ready to follow Jesus, and they might be, but they might just be asking questions, and they might ask questions 2 weeks later. They might ask questions a year later, and then maybe they ask questions a month later, and now they're ready to make that decision.
Right. Well, I also think not jumping to that, because there's not jumping to the conclusion of what we think our kids are asking us, because we also have like this Christian language that we use. I like to call it Christianese. I was taught that when I was in school. And it's just like these words that as Christians, we know, at least generally, we know what it means. Like when you say, I follow Jesus, I know what you mean by I follow Jesus. But a 4-year-old may hear I follow Jesus and think like, oh, where are we walking to?
Yeah.
And we laugh at that, but that's the concept, because if we actually step back and think about it, following Jesus is kind of abstract in some ways. We can't, we don't see him. We don't look ahead of us and know
where we're
the
walking.
path. Yeah. There's so much to that phrase that we just kind of, it's so normal because it's a good way of describing what it looks like to be a follower of Christ. That's why in the Bible, they're called Christ followers, right? Because we follow Jesus. So it's a good explanation, but it is somewhat abstract. And same thing with big churchy words, salvation, faith, hope, peace. Sometimes even describing to our kids, well, what is joy? They may come home one day and be like, Mom, Dad, I just have so much joy in my heart and I want to follow Jesus. Okay, that would be amazing. And then we ask them, okay, what does joy mean? And it's like, oh, well, we got cookies today at church, and our leader says joy is like when you get a really delicious cookie, and I really want some more cookies. And it's like, that's great, but that's not necessarily what joy fully encompasses. And because we use this like second language in church, maybe our kids know exactly what they're talking about when they say, I'm ready to follow Jesus. Maybe they know the doctrine of salvation when they approach you and are like, I am ready to surrender my life to Jesus Christ. That is very possibly true. Mm-hmm. But they also might just be repeating these words and not have a full understanding of what it means because it's the second language. And so that's one of the benefits of asking questions, is you can break down these churchy words and get them to explain what they think it means.
Which I think something you're really good at is asking questions. And sometimes, I mean, in whatever we're talking about, I'll ask you something and you're like, well, what do you think? I'm like, I asked you what you thought first. That's how this started. Like, sometimes it gets frustrating, but then for one, it makes, even just like in general conversation, you definitely see that, or as I've watched you lead or teach in different groups or whatever, and you ask those questions, it opens up people to then be able to think, okay, well, why did I ask that? Like, what did I mean? Because oftentimes, even as adults, we ask a question or we make a statement, but we have to think about what we thought when we were asking that question, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like, whenever it gets flipped back on us, it's like, okay, well, now I'm examining myself and my heart or my head or whatever. Where did that come from?
Yeah.
And I think that's annoying as an adult, but also valuable and even more valuable for our kids to be able to process, why did I ask that question? Or, yeah, what did I learn about this morning? Like, was it just that word, or like what was the meaning of it? And then like realizing maybe I wasn't paying attention at all. I just heard cookies or joy or whatever it was. But having that thought process of learning how to think about why you ask something, or think about why you're curious about something, because mm-hmm. that gets down to like what you're saying, the real meaning or the real heart behind whatever the question was.
Right. Yeah. That reminds me of, there was these videos on YouTube that I used to watch that were really cool. I don't remember who made them or where they came from or anything like that, but the whole premise of it was like an expert in their field had to describe to 5 different groups of people this certain concept or something like that. So I remember one of them was like a quantum physicist explaining a quantum computer. One of them was a composer, this like musical genius composer. And so they go through and like the first person that comes up to them, that they're explaining this concept about quantum computing, is a 6-year-old. And they have to describe quantum mechanics and quantum computing to a 6-year-old. And that's hard to do. That is really hard to do, to break something down that complex into something that simple to understand. And then there's a middle schooler or a high schooler that they then talk to them about quantum computing. And then a college student. And then someone in the field that they're talking about, and then they talk to another expert, right? So there's this progression of like from elementary to middle school to college student to someone who studies in that field to an expert to another expert in that field. And to be able to break down these complex and really hard to understand concepts. I mean, when they're talking to they're equal, when they're talking to another expert, the conversation, it just flows, and they're using very difficult to understand concepts, very big words, but the conversation flows, and they go back and forth. And sometimes they'll even say things like, I didn't think about it that way, or that's a new perspective. I learned something new, and they go back and forth on that. And sometimes that even happens with like the person in their field or the college student that just brings up a new perspective or things like that. But the conversation just flows. But when they're talking to that younger kid, when they're talking to that younger student, they still know everything about that subject, about that field, that they did when they were talking to the expert about. But to digest that and to bring it into a perspective that a 6-year-old can understand, it takes the knowledge and the wisdom of an expert to break it down into something smaller, to break it down into something digestible. And I think what's really cool about those videos is a lot of the times they use these examples that even kids can understand. And I remember that video with the composer. He's talking about, I think it was like talking about harmonies or something like that. And so he has a piano in front of him, and he plays a note, and he just asked the little kid, like, "Hey, can you sing this note as I play it?" So he hits a key on the keyboard, and the kid sings the note, and then he plays a harmony on top of that. And then he says, "Did you hear how these worked well with each other?" And he's explaining this concept that he will then go on to, to talk in great detail about, all these technical musical verbs and language and all these things. But the concept that, and the imagery and the example that he uses for the little kid is so easy to understand. Even I got it, and I was able to pick up on it. Like it's easy to comprehend. And so as we take that as parents and we translate that into teaching about Jesus, teaching about the Bible, sharing these stories and these concepts about what it looks like to have faith and trust in Jesus Christ, that we tailor our examples to the understanding of where our kids are at. And that starts with asking good questions and knowing where their heart is in that moment. But for our younger children, a lot of those examples of what following Jesus looks like will probably come out of, well, what does it look like to follow and listen to mom and dad? Right? As we're talking about submitting to Jesus, following him as the one who we trust and follow. It's going to be, the way that you listen to us when we want you to do something, sometimes you don't do it. Well, that's called disobedience. And when you disobey Jesus, that's called sin. And so that's a concept. I understand. I can understand getting in trouble by mom and dad when I don't do something right. So I guess when I don't do something right because I don't listen to Jesus, then that's called sin. Oh, okay. Well, that's a concept. That's a Christian term that now we can begin to break down and understand even at a young age, because we understand the concept of not listening to mom and dad.
Yeah. I think that those videos are a really cool example. I don't think you've told me about those. I think it's also convicting of like, my first thought is like, well, I need to be like really, in the word and on top of it and in tune with God, which yes, 100% I need to be. But to be that expert in the field, to be able to break it down to my 3-year-old, but that's not true. And then I'm like, wait, that's not true. I don't have to be an expert to tell my kids about Jesus. Like, no, nobody, but that's my first thought. But then obviously, yes, I do need to be in the word myself, and I do need to be seeking Jesus and walking with Jesus and praying with Jesus, so that when those moments and those questions do come up throughout the day, I'm not trying to give some overly churchy answer that I don't actually understand fully myself, maybe just that I heard, and I'm repeating it, and 2, so that I have been thinking through those process and thinking through my own questions and seeking Jesus in that as I'm leading my kids in that. Mm-hmm. And I think like what you said, a lot of times it's going to be that day-to-day stuff that's going to make what our kids are asking make sense to them. Like knowing, well, like in the moment that we're disciplining, or even just in a moment of like frustration that maybe multiple of our kids are having with each other, like using that as a teaching moment of relating it back to Jesus and making something that they asked 2 weeks ago now make sense because of the way they just treated their sibling. And unlike what you just said, sin is a big word, but when you break it down to disobeying Jesus is sin, just like when we've said over and over, you're disobeying me. Like, I mean, I've started using the word obey to Emerson as a 18-month-old, and obviously he has no idea what obey means right now. Like, I'll say it to him, like, you're not obeying daddy, you're not obeying mommy, but he doesn't know what it means yet. But over time, as we say it, he's going to realize, oh, when I don't do what they're telling me to do, or I jump on the couch when they're telling me to sit down, that's not obeying. So I'm not listening to what they're saying. So when I'm not obeying God, I'm not listening to what he's told us to do in his word. And relating that sin or falling short, like just some of those things in the Bible, to real life. This is how you just acted 2 minutes ago, and that's how it makes sense in the Bible.
Have your allergies been acting up? Every year when the seasons change from winter to spring and from summer to fall, my allergies start bothering me. Earthley's Sinus Saver is an herbal tincture that provides natural support during allergy season. It works best when taken consistently and helps to give you relief from sneezes, sniffles, sinus pressure, watery eyes, and all those other annoying allergy symptoms. Sinus Saver uses the power of herbs to help clear the body of excess histamines and calm allergic reactions. My family is thankful for this product, knowing we are fueling our bodies with natural things to help us feel better versus the typical over-the-counter medicines that oftentimes have other side effects. I also love that it's safe for our little one. If you're interested in Earthley Sinus Saver or any of their other products, click the link in the show notes.
And I think something that, like just talking about breaking it down to different levels, is just, there's obviously a lot of different kids' Bibles and teenage Bibles and Bibles that are just better geared to, Bible translations, and then just better geared to those younger kids. And something that, a book that a Bible, it's more of a book, I think, but that we bought and kind of have been reading with Emerson. It's obviously still over his head because he's a little kid, but I think it's good for ages like all the way to kindergarten. It's called the Jesus Storybook Bible, and it really breaks down, I've enjoyed it a whole lot. I think we both have. Breaks down the whole story of the Old Testament. I don't think we've read much of the New Testament yet, but it's really good at emphasizing that the need for Jesus at the end of every story, like, and building up to Jesus coming, and in a way that makes sense to the kids. So like the whole entire Old Testament we read through, I think, from, I don't know, close to like, was it Thanksgiving to Christmas, something like Advent? Pretty much.
It was Advent. Mm-hmm.
And so we read in 2 to 3 pages every night, made it through the whole Old Testament. So obviously it's very like, it wasn't the actual whole Old Testament, but a lot of the stories. So it's very condensed and storybook-like for kids, but it's also very good at painting the picture of we're sinners, and God saved his people, and God saved his people, and God saved his people, and then he sent Jesus to save all of us. Mm-hmm. And it's very good at like bringing out those points at the end of every single. So I think it's, as parents, maybe we don't always know how the entire Old Testament points to Jesus, even though it does, but it's hard for us to pick up on sometimes, hard for me to pick up on sometimes. This storybook Bible, the Jesus storybook Bible is really good at just painting that picture for us and kind of leaving each story open-ended almost for that conversation if your kid is asking questions or if you're wanting to have more conversation.
Yeah, it's a very like bird's eye view of the biblical story.
Yeah,
but
I think that's why I like it, because it's even for adults just to read through. It's like you get the whole general story in a very like meaningful way without all the words that you get lost in.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend this week and we were talking about Leviticus, and like when you study Leviticus, when you read through Leviticus in your daily quiet time or whatever that looks like it is a hard book to read. It can be really difficult because there's a lot of laws, there's a lot of sacrificial laws, there's a lot of purity laws, there's a lot of laws that we look at and we're like, what in the world was happening? Why is that in the Bible? And even sometimes to the point of like, this is just weird. But when we're reading the book of Leviticus that way, we have a very focused view of what is going on. We have a hyper-focused, even a hyper-focused time frame. The book of Leviticus takes place in a lot less time than the book of Genesis, in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Exodus, and the book of Numbers does. It is a quicker book because it's talking about the laws that were given. Whereas Exodus, Numbers, Genesis, Deuteronomy, they're more story driven because there's movement and there's action and there's time that's happening in those books of the Torah. But the book of Leviticus, in the context of the greater story of the Torah, is able to change your perspective of what God is doing in and of the people of Israel. And so what the storybook Bible is really good about doing is taking the things of Leviticus where, like, when you're reading through it verse by verse, it's really hard to see that grander narrative. Yeah. But when we zoom out and when we read it on 3 pages on a board book, actually, I don't think it is a board book.
It's not a board book. But
when we read it on 3 different pages and we're able to see the narrative context of, oh, that's why there's all these laws in the Bible, then it is genuinely helpful for us as adults to read this little kid's book so that we can remind ourselves that even the hard things in Scripture, the hard to read places in Scripture, or even the monotonous things in Scripture have a place to point us back to the story of redemption and salvation that leads to Jesus.
Yeah, and if your kids are a little bit older, I have not purchased this Bible yet, but we have actually, Brad and Steph, who we had on a couple weeks ago, bought this one for their oldest when she started asking a lot of questions. It's the CSB Explorer Bible for kids, and it's that a little bit easier to read translation, and I think it has pictures and some just history facts throughout it, and they've said their oldest daughter has enjoyed it a whole lot. So I would trust their recommendation in that, and I think it's good for that like next age, like the, I don't know, kindergarten to middle school age-ish, before they like get to a little bit more understanding and can have the wordier translation, if that makes sense.
Well, and I'm pretty sure they have like helpful hints, tips, and like breaks down Scripture in like some fun ways for kids and things like that.
And it looks like a real Bible, unlike the Jesus Storybook Bible. Like, it is actually the Bible.
Right.
But it's got the colors and there's some pictures, so it makes it like, still fun for kids and easier to look at and read. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think when they go from that transition of just hearing about the stories of the Bible to actually wanting to read the Word, like, and when you are ready to lead them in that transition, this is a really good Bible for that. Yeah. And even further, the next step after that, I know Britt has had a She Reads Truth Bible, and she really enjoyed that. But there's also a He Reads Truth version as well, and those are really helpful. It's not marketed for teenagers or students or anything like that. It's for adults as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And so it's that it's kind of that transitional age of like, okay, they're not a kid anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need the colorful pages. They don't need the silly things that
but it is a study Bible.
But it is a study Bible.
And it's really, I like it because at the beginning of each chapter, it gives a map, like in the Old Testament a lot of like, especially in Exodus, like this is the wilderness, this is where, and then 2, it like gives a history of what's going on leading up to that. What like year is this? What time frame is this? And then like this is the overall theme of the chapter. And then there's like reading plan to where you can connect Genesis to Matthew. I don't know. They'll choose another passage in the Bible and say like these two together make a whole lot of sense. So there's stuff like that makes it cool to study together. There's random devotional pages in there. So it's definitely geared more towards that, like, I want to say early high school, but there could be a middle schooler who's like way just engaged in wanting to read the Bible in a different way, and they're more mature. And so I'm not saying it has to be a high school age Bible, but like I generally probably like high school up most of the time.
Well, and it just goes back to knowing where your kid is at, knowing their heart.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope this was helpful. I hope, kind of help spurred on some thoughts or some thinking about how to share Jesus to your kids, how to lead them in conversations that point back to Jesus, and to lead them in conversations that show their need for Jesus in their own lives. So yeah, I hope this has been helpful. One of the things that's really helpful for us is if you guys leave ratings and reviews for us in your own podcast app. We say it a lot, but it really truly is helpful. And if you could share this with friends and family, that helps just get the word out about what we're doing, what's going on at Olive Shoots. And so we just really appreciate when you guys share the content as well. So yeah, we appreciate you guys. We're thankful for y'all. We'll talk to you next week.